Does it make sense? And is it a coincidence that Ishmael told them, hey, run between the two hills 7 times, run around the Kaaba 7 times, and somehow, magically, 7 becomes the number of the gods and goddesses that the pagans worship because they thought there were 5 planets and the sun and the moon. Gee, what a coincidence. One thing I want to share. In this article, I want to give you a little background on the pagan religion in Mecca. Mecca, Medina, that's Arabia. Mecca, according to the Muslim sources, is the place where Muhammad was born. He belonged to the Quraysh tribe, which was an Arab tribe that lived in Mecca. And according to the Muslim sources, the Meccans were into astral worship. Astral worship. Now explain what astral worship means. Like other ancient civilizations, they associated the planets and the sun and moon with their gods and goddesses. And that link I gave you, I'm quoting the late Abdullah Yusuf Ali in his translation of the Quran, which I quote. He admits that the Arabs before Muhammad and during the time Muhammad were into astral worship, where they worshiped the sun and moon and 5 planets because they thought there were only 5 planets. Now let's do the math. Sun, moon, 5 planets, that's 7, right? Follow with me. That's 7, right? Sun and moon and 5 planets, that's 7. Now, in many cultures, the sun was the male deity and the moon was the female deity. The sun was the male deity and the moon was the female consort, the female deity. Not in Arabia. In Arabia, the moon was the male deity and the sun was the female deity. And the sun was the consort, the wife of the moon. Are you with me there? Or am I confusing you? Okay. If I'm not confusing you, let me just read what Abdullah Yusuf Ali says. I can't read all of it. And do let me know if I'm buffering, because I got to read. Okay. So all of these articles, folks. Okay. Let me read what he says. This is a Muslim. Now, he's passed away, but he admits this. To revert to the worship of the heavenly bodies, okay, a few individual stars did attract the worshippers' attention, e.g. Sirius. So the Arabs worship Sirius, the dog star, the brightest fixed star in the heavens with a blush tinge in its light. It is probably Sirius that is referred to as the fixed star in the parable of Abraham. With regard to the fixed stars and their myriads, the astronomers turned their fancy to devising groups or constellations. Now, here's where it's going to get relevant, okay? But the moving stars are planets, each with a motion and therefore will or influence of its own, right? As they knew and understood them, they were 7 in number. That's what they thought, 7. And now he tells you what the 7 are. Viz, 1 and 2, the moon and the sun. So count. The 2 objects which most closely and indubitably, my lisp, influence the tides, the temperatures, and the life in our planet. 3 and 4, the 2 inner planets, Mercury and Venus. So that's 4 so far, Mercury and Venus, which are morning and evening stars and never travel far from the sun. 5, 6, and 7, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The outer planets whose elongation from the sun on the ecliptic can be as wide as possible. The number 7 itself is a mystical number as explained in note 5526. Okay, now notice what he's going to say. It will be noticed that the sun and the moon and the 5 planets got identified, these 7 planets in total, sun and moon and the 5 planets, they got identified, associated with, each with a living deity, god or goddess, with characteristics and qualities of its own. Now, before I read the rest of the part, did you catch what he just said? This is a Muslim whose Quran translation was widely circulated and distributed in the 20th century. Okay, did you see what he just said? The Arabs in Mecca, in Arabia, but in Mecca, worship the sun and moon and 5 planets as 7 gods and goddesses. 7, right? You're going to see the relevance in a minute. You're going to see the relevance in a minute. And I hope I don't put you to sleep here. Okay? I want you to listen. It's the relevance. Now let me read the rest of it. Let me skip. And let me get to the relevant part He goes, and the Arabic word for the moon, qamar, the Arabic word for the moon, qamar, is of the masculine gender. And on the other hand, the Arabic word for the sun, shams, is of the feminine gender. The pagan Arabs evidently looked upon the sun as a goddess and the moon as a god. So the Arabs in Mecca, Arabia in general, but Mecca specific because that's where Muhammad was born. They viewed the moon as the male god and the sun as the female god, the goddess. That's going to be important. Okay. So basically, I don't need to read the rest of it, but you can read it on your own leisure. Okay, folks, let me bring out the implication. The sources teach that the Kaaba in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, was a shrine that housed 360 idols. This is in the Muslim sources. It's not non-Muslim sources. 360 idols, okay, which Muhammad eventually destroyed. Okay. The Muslim sources also admit these are all documented in the articles I gave you. So you need to read these articles so you can have the sources to use to your Muslim friends. Well, say, where are you getting this from? Here, I got it from Abdul Yusuf Ali. The pagans before Muhammad would perform what they call the rites of pilgrimage, right? Hajj and Umrah, meaning they would come to the Kaaba, and those who lived there didn't need to travel. The Kaaba, that cube building that's been rebuilt on more than one occasion in Mecca, and the pagans would run around it 7 times. 7 times. Something Muslims do to this day. Muslims adopted these practices from the pagans. Muslims, like the pagans before them, right, would run 7 times. Okay. And then there are 2 hills in Mecca called Safa and Marwa. And they'd run between these hills 7 times. 7 times. And the Muslim sources say that at one time there were 2 idols on both hills. There was an idol here and an idol there, and they'd run 7 times. Now, folks, can I ask you a question? Why did the pagans run 7 times between the 2 hills, Safa and Marwa, and run around the Kaaba 7 times? Practices which Islam adopted, Muhammad observed, and Muslims continue to this day. But why did the pagans do it? Why did the pagans do it? They did it in worship of the gods and goddesses, the 7 planetary deities. Thank you. So, folks, why in the world did Muhammad continue that practice? And why are Muslims running around the Kaaba 7 times and between the 2 hills 7 times? All of which, even the Muslim sources admit, were practices that the pagans observed because they believed in the sun and moon and 5 planets as god and goddesses that they had to worship and venerate. Why are the Muslims still doing it? You know what their excuse is? You want to hear their silly excuse? Do you want to hear what their silly excuse is? Oh, because Ishmael settled in Mecca, and Abraham came and visited Ishmael, and Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba as the first house of worship. And so Ishmael taught them these practices, but as time went on, his descendants corrupted these practices and then attached them to gods and goddesses. So originally it was practices done for Yahovah, the worship of Jehovah. But then the descendants of Ishmael corrupted themselves, became idolaters, and then corrupted the practices and attached them to their gods and goddesses. Are you buying it? Does it make sense? And is it a coincidence that Ishmael told them, hey, run between the 2 hills 7 times, run around the Kaaba 7 times, and somehow, magically, 7 becomes the number of the gods and goddesses that the pagans worship because they thought there were 5 planets and the sun and the moon. Gee, what a coincidence. Let alone all the historical archaeological evidence refutes the claim that Ishmael went to Mecca. Because if you believe in your Bible, Genesis 21:21, it says Ishmael settled in the wilderness of Paran, and Paran is around Egypt and Canaan. It's not in Mecca. And Genesis 21:21 says, okay, Genesis 21:21 says that Ishmael married an Egyptian because his mother Hagar was from Egypt, and she got him a wife from Egypt. So he never settled in Mecca, and he didn't marry an Arab woman and sired the Arabs in Mecca. That's Genesis 21:21. All right? You with me there? So at least we can know and confirm, and the Muslims agree, this much. This much the Muslims admit. The pagans were doing these things, running around the Kaaba 7 times and between 2 hills 7 times, and there was an idol on each side of the hill. And the pagans thought the sun and moon and the 5 planets were gods and goddesses. So at least the Muslims admit that much. Yeah, that's what they believed, and they did it for the gods and goddesses. That means everything else is nothing but fantasy, fairy tale. The Ishmael and the Abraham story. That is fantasy, fairy tale. But the Muslims are admitting that that other part of the story, that the pagans observed these practices and long before Muhammad, and Muhammad was observing them, even when the house was steeped with 360 idols, that part they at least admit. Now, folks, let me add another thing as we get into the evidence. Do you remember what the source just stated? I just read Abdullah Yusuf Ali. He said to the Arabs, the moon, the Arabic word qammar, is masculine, denoting the fact that the Arabs viewed the moon as the male deity, meaning it was the planet, the astral object associated with the chief deity. And remember, the Arabs are what they call patriarchal society, meaning the male is the chief. So their God has to be male. He's the chief. The moon is the planet representing the chief male deity of their pantheon. You with me there? The sun is the female. The sun is the female. The sun represents the female, the goddess, that's the wife of the male deity. Okay, now folks, the moon is the male deity. Okay, because it's the planet associated with the chief god of the pantheon, the chief god worshipped by the Arab pagans and a host of gods and goddesses, and the chief god is male. So the moon, Qammar, that's a masculine now, so it's associated with the male deity who's the chief. But hold on, the chief deity is supposed to be Allah. Follow with me. The chief deity is supposed to be Allah. He's the chief deity. He's the male deity. Well, if the moon was viewed as masculine, Qammar, and it's the male deity or the planet or the object associated with the male deity, that means you just established that for the pagans, Allah was the moon god. Oh my goodness. Dum diddy dum dum.